Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Dan Fingus, and I'm the Climate Action Coordinator for Vermont Natural Resource Council. Welcome to the Environmental Justice webinar, An Equitable Approach to the Energy Transition. This is the first in a series of winter webinars that we're putting together to provide education, tools, and support to local energy leaders. I hope you can join us at future webinars, including a heat pump webinar on January 31st, and a webinar featuring Vermont Energy Education Programs community workshops on February 14th. Today's webinar, we're lucky enough to have three knowledgeable and experienced presenters to discuss environmental justice and the work that is already being done and planned to be done in Vermont. After we hear from our Agency of Natural Resource presenters, we are going to have time for questions and answers. Please, if you have questions and answers, put them in the chat and we will get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A period. I am so excited to turn it over to our facilitator for this webinar, Elena Mihaly. Elena is the Vice President of Conservation Law Foundation Vermont and a dedicated climate ally. Elena, please take it away.
Thank you, Dan. Good early afternoon, everybody. As Dan said, my name's Elena Mihaly, and I'm Vice President of CLF here in Vermont. For those of you that don't know us, Conservation Law Foundation is a more than 50-year-old environmental advocacy organization. We work regionally across New England on everything from climate to oceans to transportation, environmental justice, and it was my pleasure and honor to get to work as an advocate in helping to draft and get the Vermont's first environmental justice law across the finish line. I will say, though, that we really were just at the tail end of things, and that it was almost a decade's worth of work by many, many people to establish the need for this law and get critical data gathered to be able to cross that line of actually getting a law in place. The early pioneers of this work include Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, those working at Rejoice, and many, many others. So environmental justice is critical for Vermont because no one should have to shoulder a greater burden from the climate crisis and other environmental burdens. But we know in Vermont that people of color and low-income Vermonters in particular face a disproportionate amount of flooding and various other health and safety risks due to the impacts of climate change in particular. And we also know that current climate solutions like renewable energy and public transportation are disproportionately driven towards white, higher income residents. For example, a study that was done by Dr. Bindu Panikar here at University of Vermont recently found that communities of color were 7 times less likely to have rooftop solar than white respondents. Put differently, environmental justice underscores our inequitable present. It shows us that certain communities bear the brunt of environmental degradation while also lacking solutions or investments. And as Dr. Panikar put it so well, environmental justice is about yearning for a better future for all while creating a healing path forward for the communities that have been left behind. So Vermont's environmental justice law, which is Act 154, passed in 2022, was enacted to help move us towards that healing path. It creates an incredibly important framework upon which we have to keep building and building every year. So I'm going to lay out just a couple of the parameters that are included in this law, and then you will hear from experts at the Agency of Natural Resources who will talk more about how they are working to implement this law. First of all, the law sets out a statewide environmental justice policy that establishes that concept I was talking about before, that no one in Vermont should bear a disproportionate burden of environmental injustices, and that there should be equitable distribution of the benefits. It also defines what an environmental justice focused population is, and that is based on 3 factors: race, English proficiency, and socioeconomic level. And those figures, those factors were robustly discussed and were modeled off of other environmental justice statutes across the country. It also created an environmental justice advisory council made up of members from the community to represent and propose solutions that address the needs of those most vulnerable to environmental impacts. It also set up an interagency council. So that is one that is made up of state agency folks that help coordinate the implementation of this law. It also required careful monitoring of where certain agencies were spending their climate solutions dollars, with a goal of investing at least a proportionate amount of those dollars in communities of environmental justice focused populations. For those of you that are aware of the federal Justice 40 initiative, it sort of took that same concept and applied it here to our state environmental justice law, trying to set a goal of where dollars are spent. It also created the need for the agency to put together an environmental justice mapping tool that could be used by both state decision makers and the public to better educate ourselves about where these environmental justice focused populations live, and start to answer questions about where there are cumulative environmental burdens stacking on top of one another, so that ultimately when we make decisions, we are aware of which communities are bearing more of their fair share of certain issues, and in terms of benefits as well, and where we choose to invest. So that's kind of a framework of the law. And in terms of the folks that are on this call and how this relates to you, I think, you all are core partners to the state agencies and their efforts to implement this law. And there are really important deliverables that are going to come out of this law in terms of the EJ mapping tool and other community engagement principles that you're going to hear about more today, that are ready for you to pick up and use as you pursue your own community engagement and your own efforts to bring better energy decisions, more equitable energy decisions to the table in your communities. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to our first presenter. Karla Raimundi is the Agency of Natural Resources Director of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights, and is a friend and also a climate ally. And I'm so happy to be joined by her today, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Well, actually, I should say good afternoon. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you all, and I am so happy to see that there are these many folks interested in environmental justice in the state of Vermont. So what Sophi, my colleague Sophi, and I have prepared for you today is a presentation that will walk you through the relevant aspects of the Vermont environmental justice law that pertain to community engagement. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to start off with providing a quick overview of those relevant aspects of the law. And then I have identified several community engagement principles that I'll walk you through. And then I'll pass it on to Sophi, who's going to provide you with a case example of how this law has the potential to influence Vermont agency work. And as Elena mentioned, my name is Karla Raimundi, she, her. I am the Director of Civil Rights and Environmental Justice for the Agency of Natural Resources. And Sophi, we can start when you're ready. Thank you. Oops. There you go. Okay, so this is the text of the law as enacted for those of you who are into going to the sources of law themselves. This is how it was codified. And as Elena mentioned, two bodies were created, which are going to be important for us to keep in mind as we talk about community engagement principles and community engagement plans. The interagency committee, which is composed of 10 covered agencies, and the advisory council member. We can go to the next slide, please. In a nutshell, the core principles of community engagement as codified is the covered agencies must create and adopt community engagement plans guided by the principles of community engagement to provide the opportunity for the meaningful participation of all individuals, in particular attention to environmental justice focused populations. These terms are bolded because I'm going to define these terms for you the way that they are codified in the law. Next, please. So Vermont EJ environmental justice law definitions, for short, I'm going to be saying Vermont EJ law. First, we start with covered agencies. These agencies are found in the law and are the agencies that are responsible for implementing both the policy and the deliverables of the law. With regards to the policy, the policy in the law actually has far-reaching impacts than only impacting these 10 agencies. But these agencies are tasked with implementing both policy and deliverables contained in the law. Next up. Meaningful participation is defined in the law by providing individuals an opportunity to participate meaningfully. And what meaningfully means is providing communications in ways that can be easily accessible by all folks. So that means language access. It requires transparency of opportunities to provide input by those communities. It entails ensuring that diverse knowledge systems are incorporating into the creating of products of agencies. So that means when an agency is looking to engage with members of a particular community, paying attention to what the needs of those communities are and ensuring that those needs are met to advance opportunities for those members of those communities to show up and be prepared to participate actively and intentionally in the engagement. Next up, please. Another definition, which Elena mentioned, is environmental justice focused populations. These are the thresholds. One of the categories is at least 1% or more of the households have limited English proficiency captured in census blocks. And we're going to define limited English proficiency next. In addition to that, we have 80% of the state median household income cannot be more than the annual median household income. And we also have a factor here that includes persons of color and indigenous peoples comprising at least 6% or more of the population of that particular census block group. Next, please. Limited English proficiency. This is the definition contained in the law. From this definition, really, the agencies should ensure that communications that come out, for example, public notices alerting members of a particular community that there's going to be an opportunity to chime in into a rulemaking, for example, that those communications are available in multiple languages as per the agency's language access plans and the new report of the Office of Racial Equity regarding language access. Next up, please. So then in a nutshell, going back to that slide where I captured how the community engagement requirement or deliverable is captured by the law, covered agencies, which we define are 10 agencies, and the Office of Racial Equity, must create and adopt community engagement plans. That those plans are guiding how each of those agencies that are covered will provide meaningful participation, and we identified what meaningful participation is, ensuring that communications are transparent, opportunities are shared widely, language access is considered, accessibility is considered as well, of all the individuals, with particular attention to environmental justice focused populations. And we already discussed what those populations are. In the development, implementation, enforcement of laws, actions, and any of the activities taken by those agencies. And so now we're gonna jump into the actual document that was the first deliverable within the Vermont environmental justice law. And that was the core principle of community engagements. These principles have been put together and developed by the Interagency Committee in consultation with the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And the Advisory Council, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, I should underscore that is comprised by members of underserved, marginalized frontline communities here in Vermont, and the Agency of Natural Resources. And so the format for the document, which I will provide access to for participants of the webinar, is Section 1 lays the groundwork, and then Section 2 identifies principles so that agencies, when creating their community engagement plans, are contemplating how to meaningfully do this with the agencies. So 12 principles in total, and that will be guiding the creation of the community engagement plans. Next slide, please. So then now I'm gonna mention really briefly some of the principles, and then I'll go into more detail about 2 or 3 of those principles. So these are the Section 1 principles laying the groundwork. There are 6 principles. For example, principle number 4, coordinate with other agencies to de-silo policy conversations and share resources. Build your agency's internal capacity for meaningful engagement. Build resilience and trust by building ongoing reciprocal relationships. I would like to underscore also that the format of the document is it identifies the principle, then provides an overview of the principle, then it provides recommendations to the agencies to implement those principles, and then it also identifies resources and tools for the agencies to operationalize and embed those principles into their community engagement plans. Next up, please. So first principle that we're gonna discuss really briefly is principle number 1. Like I mentioned, the first portion of each of the capturing of the principles is an overview. So the first principle is utilize existing guidance for equitable community engagement. Yeah, what does that mean? Well, do not reinvent the wheel. Reinventing the wheel usually means overburdening communities, overtapping. It is the responsibility of agencies that before we engage in any activity, we do our due diligence and do some preparatory work that would prepare us to actually engage with the community. And that means identifying what resources are available for that specific community, whether other groups have been working in that particular community, what kind of information is relevant, is there any historic factors that should be considered before an agency steps into that community to ask for things. So it is really important that in doing this, the just transition principles that were developed by the Just Transitions Subcommittee are taken into consideration. So this is principle number 1, the overview. Next, we're gonna go to the recommendations that are included in the document. And the recommendations, as I mentioned, will give information to the agencies on how to make these principles actionable. So some of the recommendations in this principle are: start your planning process with an assessment of existing resources and guidance. Identify all the stakeholders involved. Invite them to have conversations prior to engaging with members of that community, community. In the community engagement plan, identify resources and tools for your staff, internal staff, to consult as they develop their plan of action. Next up, please. The next slide is an identification of resources and tools that each of the principles capture. So with this particular principle, these are the resources and tools that are provided and captured in the document, and they're there to ensure that agencies are supported through the thinking on the implementation and embedding of this particular principle into their community engagement plans. Next, please. The second principle that we're gonna review within that particular section of laying the groundwork for the agencies is principle number 6. And like I mentioned, the format is overview, recommendations, tools and resources. So the overview for this principle is contained in this slide. And the principle is prioritize voices most impacted by environmental injustices and address systemic barriers to participation. This right here speaks really to the core of environmental justice. And so this principle, the overview, is an identification of those things that would create the container to be able for the agencies to be able to deliver on this particular principle. Next slide, please. So the recommendations to make this principle actionable to the agencies is centering the voices of low-income folks, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or those folks who speak languages other than English. And I should add the other 2 factors that are part of the environmental justice focused population, because what we're looking to do here is center the voices of those who are most impacted, who have been historically at the margin of engagement and conversations with agencies in the creation of those rules and regulations that are gonna control how they engage with their environment and each other. Next one, please. And then resources and tools, which is the last section of each of the principles. And then here we identified a really good document that contains guides regarding interagency collaboration. Next slide, please. So this is a section 2 principles. There are 6 principles here. Compensating is the community members is the number 1 principle here, the first principle here. Doing your homework, conducting accessible and inclusive outreach. And this really speaks to accessibility and meaningful opportunity. And then we have transparency and accountability, committing enough time to take the time that's needed to engage meaningfully with members of the community, and then showing up on the ground. Next, please. So overview for principle number 7, which is compensating community members for their expertise. So this area is an area where a lot of feedback has been received. It is incredibly important that we do not take for granted the expertise and the knowledge that communities possess. And so this principle here is intended to capture the importance of compensating folks adequately for the knowledge and their contributions to the creation of work by the agencies. Next, please. And so principle number 7, the recommendations contained in the document are here. One important recommendation here is that when agencies are thinking about their budgets, that they include compensating members of communities. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is and how it's becoming an increasingly obstacle to actually getting the opportunity to work with communities, to collaborate with communities. The lack of compensation is really something that as a state we should all look at critically and try to overcome. And so then there are cross-references in the principles. So here there's a cross-reference to principle 4, which speaks to interagency collaboration and de-siloing. Next slide, please. And then resources and tools. Next. So then what now? We have this document that was created and developed in collaboration by the 2 bodies created by the Vermont Environmental Justice Law. The next step is that this document will be provided to members of the public for 40 days to receive public comment. Then the document will be finalized, and what do agencies do with it? Well, the intention is that those principles are going to be captured by the community engagement plans that the agencies develop. And so what is needed in order for the agencies to be able to capture the values that are contained in those principles, a container needs to be set. So internal work is incredibly important. Starting to have conversations regarding what environmental justice is, the value of engaging directly with community members, hearing from them what kind of impacts are the most burdensome, what kind of assets, environmental assets are needed so that communities can thrive across the board. Self and institutional awareness, doing an internal assessment of where do we stand with regards to environmental justice? What things can we do to start thinking about how to strengthen our infrastructure so that we can capture the values contained in the core principles of community engagement? And then uncover connections to EJ. What I've discovered in doing this work within the Agency of Natural Resources and in collaboration with the other 9 agencies that are covered by the law is that most of us are already doing environmental justice work. We're not aware that we're doing it. So uncovering those connections where they're at and ensuring that there is an overarching lens for environmental justice. And then uncovering those values that are captured by the principles. And like I mentioned, doing an internal analysis of where agencies' programs are, general values, statements of non-discrimination, an evaluation of language access policies, accessibility policies, all of those things that would allow for a swift but also meaningful implementation of the deliverables that are going to come out of this law. And with that, I will pass it on to Sophi, who will share with us a case study that she's working on at the Agency of Natural Resources. Thank you very much.
So much, Karla. I wanted to start by, I guess I'll introduce myself first. It's a good place to start. My name is Sophi Veltrop. I joined the Climate Action Office as our Community Engagement and Communications Coordinator back in September. And it's been great so far. A big part of my role is managing some of our community engagement efforts, which we will talk about a subset of those today. And just acknowledging that I believe that most of you are here with town energy committees, and while this framework that we're talking about is mandated for the state, anything that all of us can do to improve our community engagement and bring more people to the table in an equitable way, and have more voices influencing the decisions we make, benefits us all on all levels. Top to bottom, side to side, whatever spectrum. So I'm here to share a little bit about what we've been doing so far, and noting that this is an evolving process, and I think that's an important part of equitable and responsive community engagement, being able to respond well to community feedback and incorporate that, and be always asking, how can we do this better? And celebrate the successes and learn from when we can do better. So this work that we're doing, really trying to get on the ground with communities, meet people where they're at, rather than expecting people to come to us, the state. We set up a community engagement plan and really able to start unfolding this work this past August. And I do just want to name that in 2021, there was a lot of community engagement work that the Climate Action Office did as they helps the Vermont Climate Council prepare the climate action plan. So the tenets from the core principles of community engagement that Karla just went over with you, we're really trying to meet people where they are and work with trusted community partners. So through a contract that the Climate Action Office has with a group, we have 3 folks in Burlington who are already very connected with many folks who we want to hear from, and we're being able to contract with them and work through them allows us to really hear people's honest feedback and not have the filter of the government entity being literally physically right there at the table. We're also operationalizing, compensating people for their time, and we're able to do that through this contract that I just mentioned. And that active listening part, I'll expand on just to say that there's some hard feedback. You're going to talk, where we certainly hear from and talk to people who are not happy with various things, and being able to be there for that and welcome that, and ask questions and get deeper into the reasoning behind what they're saying is a really important skill that our contractors are phenomenal at. And then the last and essential part of this is that we're taking what we're hearing, delivering that information to people who are making these decisions, to people who are in seats of power, to practitioners across the agency. And that's a part that I'll speak to more at the end, is definitely a place that we have more growing to do. But that's sort of the close of the loop, right? We don't want to just hear from people to check the box off that we did it. We want that feedback to go to a place where it can make a difference and be meaningfully heard by the people who are in those seats. So since August, this past August, our contractors have been on the ground, getting out and meeting people. They've been to several events where they just attend personally and talk with people and have deep more engaged conversations that can last a while. And through this format, we're showing up where people already are. It's less of an ask. And we're selecting events that will reach groups and people who we may not have heard from before in these conversations, so that we can lift up those voices. We also did some tabling similarly, again, trying to reach a wide diversity of audiences. And then I'll highlight coming up soon that we're also rolling out and testing a model of having these small group conversations where we work closely with liaisons, community brokers, sorry, cultural brokers, who have direct connections to their community, and they are the ones hosting the gathering, and a small group conversation is possible. And we're really showing up at their table rather than asking somebody to show up at our table. And so we're excited to see how that goes, learn how we can make it a good system. And so those are happening both with community-based organizations who are doing work on the ground, and then also small focus groups that are with a particular community that shares an identity, for example. Oh, and then I added the e-newsletter in there in terms of like, we're also hearing from people a lot that they want to hear from us. And another part of the equitable engagement is giving people accessible information that's valuable to them. So we're also exploring more ways that we can do that, not just through our office, but through other state agencies as well. And I'll bring us to our final slide. Again, iterating that this is a process, an ongoing place for growth and learning. And I'll speak to the last two bullets on here, which is that just knowing that the contractors that we're working with are all based in Chittenden County. And so something that we need to improve on is expanding our geographic reach across Vermont. And then broadening the reach to who we're speaking with, both in terms of which leaders and decision makers we're communicating this information to, and then also reaching so many more communities and people that we have yet to connect with. And I'll pass it to Karla if you want to say anything about those first three, which correspond more so to Karla's team's work. Okay, awesome, great. And we'll share this resource with you both in the email, I think the chat as well. This online library provides resources to those core principles of community engagement and all the tools and references that document recommends. And so we'll make sure that you all have access to all of those. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it back to Dan.
I think you're passing it back to me. Thanks,
Oh,
Sophie. No worries.
To you, Elena.
Thank you. So good to hear how this, I learned a lot listening to you. It's always, a good check in terms of what you think you're doing when you're working in the State House drafting a law, and then how it's actually executed and carried out. So really helpful to hear your perspectives and where there's room to grow. So I know that we've gotten a couple of questions, but I would encourage others, please put your questions in the chat, because we've got a solid 15 or so minutes to get into the weeds on any of this. So I'll cover one that I covered in the chat, but just for purposes of the recording, somebody asked if, so the definition of an environmental justice focus population, we referenced there are 3 factors, race, limited English proficiency, and socioeconomic status. And the question asker asked if you just need to meet one of them, and the answer is you need to meet all of them. So they are and factors. And really just to go into a little bit more detail, the goal behind that was to try and look at demographic averages across Vermont and really find where there were hot spots of all 3 of those factors. Because we have lots of data to back up the fact that those indicators are directly connected with communities that suffer a disproportionate burden of environmental impacts. So there was robust discussion in committee about the definitions. And there's actually even language in the bill that provides an opportunity for updating those thresholds as we get new census data over time. Moving on to the next question, someone asked, will recommended compensation charts based on what we're asking of a community member be available and posted publicly so others can reference best practices and it can become normalized across other organizations and groups as well? And I have a similar question, and Karla and Sophie, I'll let you think about it for a minute as I just reflect that this came up during the drafting of the bill because we were trying to get adequate funds appropriated for supporting EJ law implementation. And in doing so, we were trying to get funds included in there to pay and better compensate the folks, particularly who are serving on the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Right now, the state per diem that is the default is $50 per day, which is, that law has not been updated since 1985. Even just adjusting for inflation, that should be somewhere around $150. So we are just woefully undercompensating people, particularly people for whom, you know, this is not their job to show up to these meetings. So we had to do a lot of work to work with nonprofits that do community engagement to come up with back of the napkin numbers. But I'm wondering, Karla or Sophi, if you have anything to respond to for this question in terms of whether anyone is creating a template or any kind of document that says an hourly rate that should be considered, or for meetings of this length, give this amount.
Hi, this is Karla Raimundi, Agency of Natural Resources. So this is a really good question. And as I mentioned in the presentation, an area where a lot of feedback has been received, not only from members of the communities and the Environmental Justice Advisory Council and other agencies. And I think the way that we've discussed with the Advisory Council to move forward to exact some equity evaluation is really a statewide request to revisit the per diem allocations that are allowed. $50 is inadequate. And in the implementation, I'm going to speak specifically regarding the implementation of the Vermont Environmental Justice Law. We've received feedback from members of the Advisory Council that the payment is so inadequate that there's a sense in which when things are coming up and work is required to be able to timely implement the law, there is an evaluation that has to occur on their behalf regarding whether it's doable or not for them to engage in the work or not. So these are very dedicated individuals that are committed to doing the work regardless of the inequity and the unfair rate. But yeah, I think it really requires a statewide fix. You know, the legislature should really look into what is in their regulations and laws, and really evaluate the way that Elena did, whether the compensation that's identified is really adequate. And then by engaging with members of those communities and directly with Advisory Council members and board members from the many that exist in the state of Vermont that are under the purview of many of the agencies, come up with a number that's more reasonable. There are some groups that have been considering 250, others 150, but yeah, there's a conversation really internal to the agencies, and then together with the legislature that I think is ripe.
Sophi, do you have anything to add to that question, or I can move on?
Yeah, I can just give this small specific example, and in absence of like an absolute standard, our particular contract gives a higher amount to cultural brokers or community liaisons who are doing the work of the convening, of reaching out to their community and bringing folks together, so that's more work involved. A smaller amount in a gift card to people who show up and spend their time talking in those forums. And that's just starting, but luckily we've got the framework there and the dollar amounts are spelled out in the contract, so they're consistent over time.
Can you share those dollar amounts, or are they like, is that something that A&R would make public so that folks could model off of that?
I feel like they probably are public, but since I don't know, why don't I figure that out and then share that information for distribution?
Yep, totally didn't mean to put you on the spot. Makes sense.
Okay.
Moving on to another question, which actually we all discussed in the sort of pre-meet of this call is, what burden will this environmental justice law place on municipalities? Our budgets are being stretched to meet basic services as well as cleaning up after extreme weather events. And Sophi, I feel like you had a really great allusion to this in your remarks that maybe you just want to double down on.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm not the best person to speak to the EJ law itself, so Karla, please jump in and correct me if I get any of this wrong. But my understanding is that the environmental justice law applies to the state of Vermont covered agencies, so it does not apply or require to require anything of municipalities. That being said, if you are conducting community engagement, or if that's something that you're already like dipping your toe into and want to be empowered with the resources to do that well, that absolutely trickles up to decision makers. The thing that Elena was referring to is a recent example where the state hosted an input session on a big grant that we're applying for that's related to climate and very much environmental justice and can have impacts for low-income communities, etc. And most of the people who might be impacted by that do not have the time to show up, might not hear about that through channels, but we were able to get actually a lot of folks from VECAN there because Johanna shared the event with the list. And if you all are hearing from your communities regularly, if you're hearing from a really diverse swath of your communities and people are getting to weigh in an equitable way, then that trickles up to bigger decisions at the state level, so that you can bring that to these other conversations. So yeah, not required, but certainly benefits your town and your community.
Thanks, Sophi. This next question is for Karla, specifically about the core principles for community engagement document. In terms of seeking public comment, can you share where that document is going to be posted for those 40 days in case someone wants to comment on it? And how many pages long is the document? And is there any concern or what thought have you put into the accessibility of the document itself, readability, time commitment, etc.?
Great questions. And please, Elena, if I forget to answer one of the questions, please remind me. So I don't know exactly how many pages the document, how many pages long the document is. I can pull it up and answer that question later on in the chat. But for terms of public comment, actually the document can be found right now on the Environmental Justice Online Library. It's a draft version. The recommendation from the Advisory Council was that that document be out for public comment for 45 days. So it's, and also I would like to mention here that that goes beyond what's required by the law. So the Advisory Council emphasized that it's important to get feedback from the communities that are going to be most impacted by the implementation of these principles into or the inclusion of these principles into the community engagement plans that they advised, strongly suggested that this document would be shared widely to receive public comment. And so the way that we will distribute it is, we're required to use the library system, but beyond that, it's going to be on our website. And we usually, typically, the Agency of Natural Resources, as per our language access plan, we create documents in multiple languages if requested by members of the community. If the documents are determined to be vital, they're translated proactively. And in terms of accessibility, what I mentioned, I don't know how long the document is, but regardless of the length of the document, we are working on an FAQ document to shorten and explain and capture what is contained in the document. And so the answer is yes, always thinking about how to make documents more accessible, about why dissemination of public opportunities for engagement, of going to communities as opposed to asking community members to come to us. So we are thinking through all of those factors when contemplating how to share this document with members of the public.
Thanks, you got all of the sub parts of that question.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, so this is a question for Sophi, asking if you can elaborate a bit more about the process and specifics of the contractors that the Climate Action Office is working with. How did you find them? I think we actually already covered how are they funded, and you're going to kind of follow up with a little bit more. But this person just notes that some town energy committees want to engage in this practice, and just having a little bit more info to include how you made these links would be useful.
Absolutely. So just to round out that funding question, like where that comes from is the Climate Action Office's budget, which is appropriated by the legislature or in the annual budget bill. So I'm not sure if that's like terribly helpful on the municipal level. And the folks who are on the ground doing this community engagement work on behalf of the Climate Action Office, two of them were originally engaged with a subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. So they started out as subcommittee members and had a role in drafting our document that's called the Guiding Principles of a Just Transition. They served on that subcommittee. So we're already interested in this particular subject matter and had that expertise, had that connection to a lot of folks who we want to hear from. And then so there are three of them, and then one other person is on the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. And I'm not sure exactly how we connected with her, but basically connecting with people who are already in with the community, with the communities you're trying to reach, finding those people who can serve as bridges, who can both accurately and accessibly share the information that is wanted by people and can hear the feedback, digest it, and bring it back to in your case, the Town Energy Committee, in a really clear and unfiltered way. And our contractors were stars at that and started out in a relationship with the Climate Action Office and the Vermont Climate Council, and then we pivoted to contracting with them in this particular role.
Thanks, Sophi. I see that we're nearing 1 o'clock, so we've got one more question, which I think I can answer pretty succinctly and then move us into concluding remarks. But This person asked, is there more to share at this point about how Vermont's EJ principles will guide state agencies in their implementation of $58 million within the IRA's home energy rebate program? Department of Energy requires that at a minimum, states endeavor to use approximately 40% of program funds for low-income and disadvantaged households, but the state should set aside substantially more than that for EJ communities. And that is what the EJ law here in Vermont contemplates, is that we will go above and beyond Justice 40. Basically, when you look at the EJ factors of what establishes someone in an EJ focus population, about 55% of Vermont falls into that definition. It's a large portion of Vermont. You can kind of take factors out and look just at limited English proficiency, just at race, just at low income status. But that's what the law contemplates, is roughly directing 55% of those funds towards EJ focused populations. It is a goal in the law. It's not a mandate. But that is something that the administration has to work on next, which is a guide for how exactly that funding will filter down, and what does it look like to direct investments in EJ communities. So I am going to bring us home, and just thanks to everyone for joining us. As you were shared in the chat, you have now access to these incredible community engagement core principles, the draft of them. Please consider commenting on them if you have comments. You've now got contact information for Sophi if you have questions and want to connect with someone at the Climate Action Office. You can also call your legislator and consider telling them that you've just learned about the environmental justice law and how important the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee council is to getting this work done, and how they are under-resourced, and to consider increasing the per diem that these folks are getting paid, or just bolster EJ program funding writ large. You've got a bunch of resources, and Dan put in the chat the next VECAN webinars over the next few weeks. So thanks again for joining. And Dan, I don't know if you have any closing remarks.
Definitely not. Just please join us again. And thank you so much to Karla, to Sophi, and to Elena for their amazing work during this hour. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.